The cell was cold. Outside, in the vast and oppressive state of Mississippi, the heat of a scorching June seemed to melt the asphalt, making the air shimmer with the southern heat wave. Cicadas chirped their monotonous song, and the sun beat down mercilessly, weighing on every soul who stepped on that land. But inside the concrete and steel walls of death row, time had stopped. There, in a parallel universe of suspended anguish, the seconds didn't flow. They dragged on, each one an echo of eternity. In one of those cells, unaware of the suffocating heat outside but trapped in his own personal hell, lay Richard Gerald Jordan. He was 78 years old, an age that for most means the tranquility of twilight, the peaceful memories of a life lived. But for Jordan, it was the accumulated weight of decades behind bars. He had spent more than half of his life behind bars, a span that dwarfed the freedom he once knew. His skin, wrinkled and marked by age, and his gaze, veiled by the fatigue of an endless existence, were the silent testimony of years stolen, or perhaps years paid. And that confinement was no accident. It wasn't the whim of fate, nor a bad stroke of luck. Number It was the inescapable result of a decision. A cold and final choice made nearly half a century ago. A crime, an act of violence that had pursued him, like a perpetual shadow, for 47 long years. During that time, justice, slow but relentless, had chased him, caged him, and finally condemned him. June 25th, 2025. That was the date marked on the calendar, the final line in the inexorable march of time. That day, the crime he had committed decades earlier, the decision that sealed his fate, would finally catch up with him. There would be no more appeals, no more delays, no more waiting. The machinery of capital punishment, once activated, does not stop. What thoughts crossed the mind of a man at the end of his life, facing the final bill for the sins of his youth? The silence of his cell was a prelude to the final silence, the culmination of a journey that began with violence and ended with extinction. The clock ticks inexorably toward June 25th, 2025. Richard Gerald Jordan approaches his final hour, a 78-year-old man who has spent more than half his life behind bars. But who really is this man? A soulless hitman, a cold and calculating figure who carried out a contract killing without a shred of remorse? Or a man perhaps trapped in a legal web that tightened around him, a web that, despite decades of incarceration, never offered the promise of redemption or the chance to escape his own past? This is not just the story of one more execution in the annals of the Mississippi prison system. It is a deep immersion into a story about time, that relentless judge who fades memory but does not erase consequences. It is a raw examination of justice, its imperfections, its slow yet sure gears, and the morality of its final decisions. It is an exploration of remorse, or the absence of it, in a man who has had nearly half a century to reflect on his actions. And fundamentally, it is a disturbing chronicle of how a crime committed in 1976, in the fervor of another era, under circumstances that still raise questions today, still echoes in 2025. A vibration stretching from the darkness of a distant past to the most immediate present, to the exact date of his last breath. Prepare to enter a case where the shadows of the past refuse to dissipate, and where truth is sometimes as elusive as justice. Are we witnessing a final act of deserved retribution, or will we see a conclusion that leaves more questions than answers about the human soul and the purpose of punishment? Hattiesburg, Mississippi, January 1976. The city, like many others in the deep south of the United States, awoke slowly each morning under a veil of apparent calm. These were days that, in retrospect, seemed simpler, more innocent. Wooden houses stood proudly, separated by wide lawns that invited outdoor life. At that time, door locks were often little more than a formality, a precautionary gesture rather than an impenetrable barrier against danger. Trust was the currency in small communities. But that illusion of safety was about to be shattered, leaving a deep wound in Hattiesburg's soul. In one of those houses, wrapped in the quiet dignity of her home, lived Edwina Marta, a 37-year-old woman, a businesswoman with a sharp mind for commerce and, tragically, recently widowed. Her husband, a successful contractor, had recently died, leaving her a considerable inheritance, a fortune that, unbeknownst to her, would become a target, an invisible mark painted on her back. Edwina, unaware of the darkness descending upon her, lived under the weight of mourning and the promise of an uncertain future, but never with the fear that her wealth would make her prey. On January 12th, a cloudy and cold day, the doorbell rang. Edwina, with the candor allowed by the era, opened the door to a stranger who, with a forced smile and a monotone voice, claimed to have a package for her. A message, a delivery, a pretext as simple as it was effective. Edwina, suspecting nothing, let him in, unwittingly inviting death into her home. The door closed behind him, sealing the fate of a life. Edwina Marta would not leave that house alive. Her home, once a sanctuary of peace, would become the scene of a crime that would shake the foundations of community trust. That man was Richard Jordan. He entered that house not with a package, but with a hidden gun and a precise mission: to kidnap Edwina for ransom. The widow's wealth was the bait. The promise of easy fortune had pushed him to cross the line of morality. But something went terribly wrong. Carefully laid plans often crumble in the chaos of human confrontation. Was there resistance? A scream? A fatal mistake in the execution of the plan? According to police and court reports, the woman was taken from her home and driven deep into the Pine Belt forest on the outskirts of town. A place of towering pines and overwhelming silence. The perfect location for a crime to vanish without a trace, for a body to be lost forever. There, in nature's oppressive solitude, with no witnesses, no chance of escape or rescue, Richard Jordan shot her once in the head. A cold, definitive act that ended Edwina Marta's life and sealed Richard Jordan's fate. Then, with calculated brutality, he buried her, believing the secret would remain hidden beneath the soil. The family's desperation, the police's uncertainty, the relentless search, all dragged on for days that felt like centuries. But Richard Jordan's secret did not withstand the weight of his own conscience, or perhaps the pressure of the investigation. Edwina Marta's body was found, not by a trail uncovered with forensic skill, but thanks to a confession, his own. It was Jordan's voice, broken or resigned, that finally guided authorities to the place of horror. A macabre twist that sealed not only the killer's guilt, but also the harsh truth of what had happened in that idyllic forest. What drove him to confess? That question would linger, even decades later, as Richard Jordan awaited his own end. The discovery of Edwina Marta's body and the confession of Richard Gerald Jordan did not only solve a heinous crime, they unleashed a wave of shock that rippled throughout the state of Mississippi. The question settled in everyone's mind, an unsettling echo in every conversation. Who was this 29-year-old man, with an apparently normal life, who had planned and executed such a cold and meticulous crime? The image of a ruthless killer hiding beneath a facade of normalcy was a terrifying idea. Richard Gerald Jordan did not fit the mold of the common criminal society was used to. He was not a repeat offender with a history of violence. On the contrary, he was considered intelligent, even with some incomplete university studies, a sign of promise left unfulfilled. He had no known criminal record, which made his involvement in a kidnapping and murder even more bewildering. What truly shocked investigators and the public was the coldness with which he carried out the act, and the speed with which he ultimately confessed. What kind of mind operated with such detachment? His explanation was as straightforward as it was disturbing. He did it for money. With chilling simplicity, he claimed someone had paid him to commit the crime, a macabre contract that made him a hired executioner. This statement opened the door to a larger criminal network, to the idea that Richard Jordan was merely a piece on a more complex chessboard. But despite his claims, the truth about a possible accomplice never emerged. A second responsible party was never identified. The investigation stalled at that point, leaving a loose thread that would fuel doubt for decades. Was he lying to dilute his guilt, or had the real mastermind behind the crime truly evaded justice? In court, the prosecution was emphatic. Convinced that Jordan's confession was sufficient and that his claims about a pair were merely an attempt to deflect blame, they firmly maintained that Jordan had acted alone. To them, he was both the mastermind and the executor. They argued vehemently that he had planned it with a criminal mind, executed it with calculated coldness, and covered it up with determination, until guilt or investigative pressure forced him to crack. The prosecution's narrative painted him as a lone wolf, a predator who had acted purely out of greed, without outside influence. The defense, for its part, desperately tried to construct a different story. They sought to humanize a man who appeared devoid of emotion. They argued that Jordan had been manipulated, that he was not the brain behind the crime, but a tool in others' hands. Moreover, they tried to introduce the idea that he suffered from deep depression, a condition that would have made him vulnerable and driven him to make decisions that, in a healthy mental state, he would never have considered. They claimed he needed help, not a lethal injection. That prison and treatment were the answer, not death. It was a plea for compassion, to see beyond the act and recognize the complexity of the human mind. But the defense failed. The story of a solitary man, motivated by money and his confession leading authorities to the body, outweighed everything else. The verdict was clear and forceful, guilty of capital murder. And with that guilt came the harshest sentence the state could impose, the death penalty. The jury and judge did not see a manipulated or depressed man, but a murderer, a man who deserved the ultimate punishment. The fate of Richard Gerald Jordan was sealed that day. A one-way ticket to death row, awaiting an end that would take nearly half a century to arrive. Was this unyielding justice, or the echo of an unsolved mystery? The question still floats in the Mississippi air. What followed Richard Gerald Jordan's initial conviction was a judicial saga written in the ink of time and frustration, becoming one of the longest and most tortuous cases in Mississippi's legal history. A legal labyrinth that would test the patience of the system, the families of the victims, and the condemned man's own mental health. Richard Jordan was first sentenced to death in 1976. For many, justice had been served. But that first conviction, far from being the end, was only the beginning of a legal odyssey. In 1977, a year after his sentence, his conviction was overturned due to errors in the trial. An unexpected reprieve for Jordan, but a devastating blow to Edwina Marta's family, who saw closure slip through their fingers. What procedural errors had been so severe as to reverse a death sentence? The hope of swift justice faded, but the system didn't give up. Jordan went back to trial. The evidence, the testimonies, the confession, everything was reviewed. And once again, he was sentenced to death. It seemed the wheel of justice had spun in his favor, only to return him to the same starting point. The death penalty once more loomed over him. And so the cycle began. He appealed again, and once more, the case was overturned. Another legal victory, another setback for the prosecution, another eternity of waiting for Jordan. This macabre dance between convictions and reversals dragged on for over 4 decades, turning the case of Richard Jordan into a symbol of the complexity and, at times, the inefficiency of the American judicial system. 4 trials with different juries, new evidence, and old ghosts. 6 sentences, each a promise of an end that never arrived, and multiple appeals, both federal and state, each one a legal battle fought in the nation's highest courts. Each new judicial proceeding, each appeal, questioned different aspects that revealed possible cracks in the machinery of justice. Improper jury instruction, errors in the directions given to jurors, which could have unduly influenced their deliberations and verdict. Were the jurors fully aware of all the case's complexities or their rights and responsibilities? Inadmissible evidence, the inclusion or exclusion of evidence that didn't meet strict legal standards, which could have skewed the trial's outcome. Was the jury presented with a full and fair picture of the facts? Ineffective legal representation. Allegations that Jordan's defense attorneys did not provide adequate and competent counsel, a fundamental right for any defendant. Did Jordan have a real chance to defend himself, or was he a victim of legal incompetence? Ethical questions about keeping him on death row for decades without execution. This point, the most painful and philosophical, questioned the morality of keeping a man on death row for such a prolonged period. Is it just? Is it ethical to subject a person to the agony of 47 years' wait, living day to day with the certainty of imminent death? Does the wait itself become a form of cruel and unusual punishment? The story of Richard Jordan is a grim reminder that justice is not always a straight path, but often a winding one, full of detours, errors, and ethical dilemmas. His case became a symbol of the inherent challenges of the death penalty and the search for truth in an imperfect system. And as the date of his execution nears, the question remains, will this finally be the closing of a cycle or just another chapter in the eternal quest for true justice? Simulated excerpt, voice of a fictional legal expert. This is a paradigmatic case, not because Jordan was innocent, but because the system became part of the punishment. He was convicted as many times as years he had lived, and justice became a circular process. The case of Richard Gerald Jordan is not just a legal labyrinth. It is a story of endurance and, at the same time, psychological devastation. Because no other death row inmate in the United States had spent as much time waiting to be executed as Jordan. 47 years. It's a number that defies comprehension, a testament to the slowness of the system and the inherent cruelty of waiting on death row. From 1976 until that fateful June 25, 2025, the clock marked 17,854 days behind bars. More than half of them spent in near-total isolation, a silent torture that eats away at the soul. Imagine the loneliness, the suffocating silence of a 2-by-3-meter cell, the outside world reduced to a slit in the door. What does a human mind do during almost 5 decades of confinement, knowing that any day could be the last? Jordan was a mute witness to the history that unfolded beyond the prison walls. He lived through the turn of the century, the passing of the millennium, like a ghost anchored in the past. He witnessed the rise and fall of presidents, saw leaders and administrations parade by without his fate changing. He even lived through changes in the method of execution in Mississippi, from the electric chair to lethal injection, a macabre irony of justice evolving while his life remained frozen. As the decades passed, Richard Jordan showed a clear transformation. The man who was once the enigmatic killer or the manipulated pawn became a tired old man. In 2012, a surprising turn. He wrote a letter requesting that his sentence be carried out. "I am tired," he declared with disarming clarity. "I no longer fear death." This confession of fatigue, not guilt, revealed the profound despair of a man who preferred the end to the torture of waiting. Was it a final surrender or an act of defiance? However, despite his wish, the appeals continued by legal default. The system, in its complexity, sometimes moves by inertia, by protocol, beyond the will of the individual. Lawyers, committed to defending rights, continued exploring every possible avenue, prolonging Jordan's agony, even against his will. A fictional criminologist, whose voice echoes with the experience of having studied countless cases like Jordan's, offers a chilling perspective. The psychological deterioration in cases like Jordan's is profound. Living under sentence without knowing when you'll die, with the sword of Damocles constantly hanging over your head, produces effects similar to prolonged torture. It is a constant erosion of the mind, of the spirit. Hope becomes a burden, and uncertainty, the cruelest punishment. Jordan was a forced spectator of the macabre dance of death row. He witnessed others come and go. Some were executed within months or a few years, their fate swiftly fulfilled. Others, with unexpected twists of destiny, were released due to innocence, vindicated by new evidence or judicial errors. But he remained, always there, an immovable anchor in the constant flow of lives that passed through death row, a ghost of never-ending justice, waiting for an end that took nearly half a century to arrive. His story is a chilling reminder of the human cost, not just of crime, but also of justice that stretches endlessly. The calendar marked June 25th, 2025, a date burned into the mind of Richard Gerald Jordan and into the records of the state of Mississippi. That day, the inevitable end of an era of endless litigation and anguished waiting became painfully real. The state of Mississippi confirmed with the coldness of an official announcement that all appeals had been exhausted. Every legal loophole, every possible avenue of escape had been closed. There were no more technicalities, no more delays. Time had finally caught up with Richard Jordan. The United States Supreme Court, the last instance of hope for so many death row inmates, refused to review his case. With that decision, the door to any federal intervention was definitively shut, like a resounding slam sealing a destiny. And then came the final recourse of mercy, the last plea for clemency. But the governor of Mississippi did not grant it. The signature on that document, or its absence, was the final nail in Richard Jordan's coffin. Politics, the law, and retribution had aligned to ensure that the sentence would be carried out. At 6 p.m., the designated time for his last walk, Richard Jordan would be taken to the execution chamber at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in Parchman. Parchman, a name that evokes images of southern plantations and a dark past, a penitentiary shrouded in legends and horrors. Within its walls, the execution chamber awaited, a sterile space designed for completion, for final silence. Imagine the weight of those moments. Jordan's footsteps echoing in the halls, each one a reflection of the 17,854 days he spent imprisoned. The held breaths of the guards, the racing pulses of those accompanying him on that one-way journey. A 78-year-old man, exhausted, who had asked for an end to his agony, now faced it. What thoughts might have crossed his mind as he walked toward the point of no return? A final flicker of remorse, the cold acceptance of the inevitable, or a fleeting memory of that January day in 1976 in Hattiesburg when his life took its darkest turn. The story of Richard Jordan, so long and complex, would culminate in those final minutes, in the silence of a room that had already witnessed too many endings. The final chapter was about to be written, not in words, but in an irreversible act. The case of Richard Jordan raises multiple questions. Is it fair to execute someone almost 50 years after the crime? Is it still capital punishment or punishment by attrition? Does society benefit from keeping a person alive for half a century only to kill him? Many activists question whether the case reflects effective justice or a broken system. Simulated audio excerpt from a civil rights attorney. The problem isn't whether he deserved to die. It's that the process took so long it no longer looked like justice. It looked like endless vengeance. Richard Jordan will die at 78 years old. He lived more years in prison than he did in freedom. He murdered a woman who trusted him. And for that, the state decided he should die. Almost half a century later. He wasn't executed for who he was in 2025, but for what he did in 1976. That is the dilemma of the death penalty. It doesn't kill the murderer from back then, but the old man who remains. Was it worth it? That answer isn't in the court record. It's in those who still believe that justice and time can coexist, or in those like Edwina Marta who never made it home.